In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a glass of poisoned port shatters the silence of Greystone Manor. Colonel Lucius Prothero lies dead, and a single thumb mark points to his niece, Eleanor Vance. But is she truly guilty? Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose keen eyes unravel a web of jealousy, betrayal, and hidden secrets. From a bitter housekeeper to a debt-ridden cousin, every suspect hides a motive, and every clue twists the truth. Can Miss Marple unmask the real killer before innocence is lost forever? The clock is ticking in this chilling tale of murder and deception. Chapter 1. The Death at Greystone Manor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawns of Greystone Manor, a Georgian pile that loomed over St. Mary Mead with an air of weary dignity. Its grey stone facade, mottled with lichen, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and the tall windows stared blankly at the village below. Inside, the house was silent save for the slow tick of a grandfather clock in the hall, its pendulum marking time with relentless precision. Colonel Lucius Prothero, the manor's master, was not a man to tolerate noise or, indeed, much of anything that disrupted his rigid routine. So when a piercing scream shattered the stillness that Tuesday evening, it was as though the very walls of Greystone recoiled. The scream came from Jenny, the young parlourmaid who had entered the colonel's study to clear his tea tray. She stood frozen in the doorway, her apron twisted in her hands, staring at the figure slumped over the mahogany desk. Colonel Prothero, his grizzled hair dishevelled, his face a ghastly mask of pain, clutched a spilled glass of port, his eyes, wide and unseeing, fixed on some invisible horror. Jenny's cries brought Eleanor Vance, the colonel's niece, running from the drawing room, her embroidery hoop clattering to the floor. "Uncle Lucius," she gasped, rushing to his side, but one touch of his cold hand told her the truth. The colonel was dead by dusk. St. Mary Mead buzzed with the news. Dr. Haydock, summoned from his surgery, pronounced the cause of death with grim certainty: poisoning, likely arsenic, judging by the colonel's contorted features and the faint, bitter scent clinging to the glass. The village constable, a ponderous man named Barnes, secured the study, while whispers of murder rippled through the cottages and shops. Suspicion, like a chill wind, settled on Eleanor Vance, the quiet, dark-eyed girl who had lived at Greystone. Since her parents' death a decade before, had she not poured the colonel's port that evening? And was it not known that she and her uncle had clashed of late, their voices raised behind closed doors? In her rose-covered cottage at the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The evening's gossip had reached her via Mrs. Price, the postmistress, who had stopped by with a parcel and a torrent of speculation. "They're saying it's the niece, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price declared, her eyes gleaming. "Mark my words, there's bad blood there. Why, only last week I heard the colonel shouting at her about some young man, Dr. Gale. I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple nodded absently, her mild blue eyes fixed on the skein of wool. "How very distressing," she murmured, but her mind was already turning, sifting through the village's patchwork of half-truths and rumours. Greystone Manor had long been a source of fascination in St. Mary Mead, its inhabitants a study in contrasts. Colonel Prothero, a retired military man of 60, was known for his brusque manner and unforgiving standards. His wealth, though diminished by years of lavish spending, still lent him an air of authority, and his temper was the stuff of village legend. Eleanor, by contrast, was a gentle presence, her delicate beauty and soft-spoken ways endearing her to some, though others found her reserve aloof. The household was completed by Major Henry Prothero, the Colonel's cousin, a florid man with a penchant for whiskey and cards, and Mrs. Clara Baines, the housekeeper, whose pinched face and silent tread made her a figure of unease. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to tend her geraniums, her thoughts drifting to Eleanor. The girl had always struck her as burdened, carrying some quiet sorrow beneath her composed exterior. At the church bazaar last month, Miss Marple had watched Eleanor hesitate over a stall of second-hand books, her fingers lingering on a volume of poetry before she turned away, as if denying herself even that small pleasure. There is something there, Miss Marple mused, snipping a wilted leaf with precision. Something that does not quite fit. She recalled to a long ago case in the villager governess accused of theft, her guilt assumed until a sharper eye uncovered the true culprit. People see what they expect to see, she said softly to herself, and that is often their mistake. As twilight deepened, the lights of Greystone Manor burned late, their glow visible from Miss Marple's garden. Inspector Slack, a brisk man from Much Benham, had arrived to take charge, his voice barking orders as he interviewed the household. The village awaited his verdict with bated breath, certain that Eleanor's arrest was imminent. But Miss Marple, returning to her knitting, felt no such certainty. The Colonel's death, she sensed, was not a simple matter of greed or spite. There were currents beneath the surface, secrets woven into the fabric of Greystone's walls, and she, with her unassuming air and relentless curiosity, would unravel them one stitch at a time. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Suspicion, the morning after Colonel Lucius Prothero's death. St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves mourned the grim events at Greystone Manor. The village, usually a place of gentle, routine milk bottles clinking on doorsteps, the postman's whistle, the chatter of children bound for school, hummed with a feverish undercurrent. In the butcher's shop, the grocer's, and the tea-room, tongues wagged with a single refrain. Murder and Eleanor Vance at its heart. The news of the arsenic, confirmed by Dr. Haydock's post-mortem, had spread like a spark through dry grass, and the thumb mark on the fatal glass, smudged but unmistakably Eleanor's, was the tinder that set suspicion ablaze. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her small parlour with its chintz, curtains, and polished walnut table, listened to the villagers' pulse through her open window. The air carried snippets of conversation, Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's housekeeper, lamenting the Colonel's fate. Young Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, embellishing the tale with ghoulish delight. Miss Marple's knitting lay in her lap, a soft grey scarf taking shape beneath her deft fingers, but her attention was elsewhere. She had not yet visited Greystone Manor since the tragedy, preferring to let the first wave of hysteria subside. People are never so revealing as when they think themselves unobserved. She had once remarked to her nephew Raymond, and she applied that principle now. Gathering the villagers' whispers like so many scattered threads, her opportunity came. At midday, when Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, invited her to tea at the vicarage. "I thought you might like to see Eleanor, Jane," Mrs. Clement said over the telephone, her voice warm but tinged with anxiety. "She's staying with us for a day or two, poor child. She's quite shattered." Miss Marple accepted at once. Sensing a chance to observe the girl at close quarters, she donned her best black hat, its brim adorned with a discreet spray of violets, and set out along the lane, her step brisk despite her years. The vicarage, a rambling house with ivy-clad walls, stood opposite the church, its garden a riot of roses and delphinium. As Miss Marple approached, She noted the curtains drawn in the upstairs windows, a sign, perhaps, of Eleanor's retreat from the villagers' prying eyes. Inside, the vicarage parlour was a haven of faded comfort. Worn armchairs, a chipped tea service, and a vase of Michaelmas daisies on the mantel. Mrs. Clement, a plump woman with kind eyes, greeted Miss Marple with a sigh. "It's dreadful, Jane, simply dreadful," she said, pouring tea from a silver pot. "Eleanor hasn't slept a wink, and the village, well, you know how they talk." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern, though her mind was alert, cataloguing every nuance. Eleanor joined them shortly, her movements slow, as if each step cost her effort. She was a slight figure, her dark hair pinned neatly, but her face pale, her eyes shadowed with strain. "Miss Marple," she said softly, managing a faint smile, "it's kind of you to come." The girl's voice was steady, but Miss Marple detected a tremor beneath it, like a taut string ready to snap. "My dear, I only wish to offer what comfort I can," Miss Marple replied, accepting a slice of seed cake. She watched Eleanor closely, noting the way her hands twisted in her lap, the quick glance toward the window as a cart rattled past. Fear, Miss Marple thought, but of what? Guilt, or merely the weight of accusation? She recalled a long-ago incident. In St. Mary, Mead, a housemaid, wrongly blamed for a stolen brooch, her terror born not of crime but of powerlessness. The innocent, Miss Marple mused silently, often wear their fear more openly than the guilty. Conversation turned, as it must, to the Colonel's death. Mrs. Clement, with the tact of a clergyman's wife, avoided direct mention of murder, speaking instead of the Colonel's prominence in the parish. "He was such a presence at Greystone," she said, "always so particular about everything." Eleanor's lips tightened, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "He must have been a challenging man to live with," she ventured, her tone mild. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Uncle Lucius was set in his ways," she said carefully. "He liked order, and I tried to please him," but she broke off, her eyes dropping to a teacup. "But," Miss Marple prompted gently, her needles clicking rhythmically, a soothing counterpoint to the tension in the room. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. "We didn't always agree," she admitted. "He thought I was too young to make my own decisions about friends, about my future." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the word friends. Was this a reference to Dr. Simon Gale, the young physician whose name had surfaced? In Mrs. Price's gossip, she filed the thought away, her face betraying nothing but kindly interest. Mrs. Clement, eager to ease the moment, changed the subject to the upcoming church fete, but Miss Marple's attention remained on Eleanor. The girl's reserve was not, she sensed, the coldness some villagers ascribed to her, but a shield forged from years of living under her uncle's domineering shadow. Miss Marple thought of her own youth, of aunts and uncles whose expectations had shaped her world, and felt a pang of sympathy. Yet sympathy, she knew, must not cloud judgment. The thumb mark on the glass was a fact, and facts, however inconvenient, demanded scrutiny. Tea concluded. Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return with a jar of her homemade damson jam. As she walked home, the village seemed to close, ranks around its secrets. At the post office, Mrs. Price leaned over the counter, her voice low. "Inspector Slack's been at Greystone all morning," she confided. "They say he's got his eye on Miss Vance found her fingerprints. They did, clear as day." Miss Marple murmured something vague, her mind racing. Fingerprints, or, more precisely, a thumb mark, were damning, but their clarity troubled her. In her experience, the guilty were rarely so careless, unless carelessness was itself a design. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. The thumb mark gnawed at her, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. She thought of the inquest held that morning in the village hall, its details relayed by her gardener, Mr. Dobbs, who had attended with relish. Inspector Slack, with his usual bluster, had questioned Eleanor sharply. She admitted to serving the colonel his port, a nightly ritual, but swore she had left the study immediately after. The glass, found beside the body, bore her thumb mark, smudged but identifiable, and traces of arsenic in the dregs sealed the case against her, or so Slack believed. "He's got it all tied up neat," Mr. Dobbs had said, shaking his head. "Poor Miss Eleanor's in for it." Miss Marple, however, was not so easily convinced. She considered the other players in Greystone's drama. Major Henry Prothero, the colonel's cousin, was a man of loud opinions and dwindling fortunes, his presence at the manor a source of friction. Mrs. Clara Baines, the housekeeper, was another enigma woman of few words but sharp eyes, her loyalty to the colonel tempered by years of slights. And then there was Dr. Simon Gale, the village's new physician, whose name clung to Eleanor like a shadow. Each, Miss Marple knew, had their own motives, their own secrets, waiting to be teased out. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Griselda, Mrs. Clement's young cousin, who often visited the vicarage and had a knack for gossip. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's too awful," Griselda exclaimed, flopping into a chair, her fair curls bouncing. "They're saying Eleanor poisoned her uncle for his money can, you imagine. And Major Henry's been at the Red Lion, telling everyone she's a schemer." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, encouraging Griselda to continue. "He says the colonel changed his will last month, left nearly everything to Eleanor." Mrs. Baines was furious. Too, she thought she'd get a legacy after all her years of service. Miss Marple listened, her needles never faltering. The will was a new thread, one that tangled the motives further. Money, she knew, was a timeless spur to violence, but so too was resentment, or fear, or love twisted into something darker. She recalled a case from her youth, a cousin's death in a country house. The inheritance disputed, the true killer unmasked only by a chance remark. "People talk too much," she said aloud, her voice soft. Griselda blinked. "What's that, Miss Marple?" The old lady smiled. "Only that talk is a great revealer, my dear, if one knows how to listen." Griselda departed, leaving Miss Marple to her reflections. She rose to tend her indoor plants, her fingers brushing the velvety leaves of a begonia as she pondered the thumb mark's oddity. It was too prominent, too conveniently placed. In her mind's eye, she saw the colonel's study, the heavy desk, the leather-bound books, the decanter of port gleaming in the lamplight. Eleanor had poured the drink, yes, but who had handled the glass after? The answer, she sensed, lay not in the mark itself, but in its intent, a clue meant to mislead, or a mistake born of haste. The clock struck 6, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside to prepare simple meal of soup and bread, for she valued frugality as much as insight. As she stirred the pot, her thoughts returned to Eleanor's demeanour at the vicarage. The girl's fear was genuine, but it was not, Miss Marple suspected, the fear of discovery. It was the fear of a trap closing, of a truth she could not prove. "She is protecting someone," Miss Marple murmured, "or something." The idea took root, fragile but persistent, like a seedling in her garden, outside. The village settled into evening, its lights flickering against the gathering dark. At Greystone Manor, Inspector Slack pored over statements, his notebook filled with accusations and half-truths. The thumb mark, the arsenic, the will all pointed to Eleanor, and yet Miss Marple felt a niggling doubt. She thought of the Colonel, a man whose rigidity had bred enemies, whose secrets had outlived him. He was not a man to die quietly, she said to herself, slicing bread with care, and his death, I think, will speak loudly yet. As she sat down to her meal, Miss Marple's mind was already weaving the next steps. She would visit Greystone tomorrow, under some pretext, perhaps an offering for the church flower fund. There, she would watch and listen, letting the household reveal itself. Major Henry's bluster, Mrs. Baines's silences, the shadow of Dr. Gale's devotional were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. The shadow of suspicion hung heavy over Eleanor, but Miss Marple, with her quiet tenacity, was determined to lift it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 3. The Family's Secrets. The third day after Colonel Lucius Prothero's death dawned crisp and bright in St. Mary Mead. The autumn sunlight gilding the thatched roofs and casting dappled patterns on the cobbled lanes. Yet beneath the village's picturesque calm, a current of unease persisted, fed by the unresolved mystery at Greystone Manor. The inquest had done little to quell speculation. If anything, it had tightened the noose of suspicion around Eleanor Vance's slender neck. The thumb mark on the poisoned glass, the arsenic in the port, and the newly revealed will naming Eleanor as the chief beneficiary formed a damning triad in the village's collective mind. But Miss Jane Marple, tending her chrysanthemums in the soft morning light, was not swayed by the tide of gossip. She knew that truth, like a shy bloom, often hid in the shadows of assumption. Her plan for the day was simple yet deliberate: a visit to Greystone Manor, ostensibly to deliver a stack of parish magazines for the church's winter charity drive. The excuse was flimsy, but Miss Marple had long mastered the art of blending into the background, her unassuming presence disarming even the wariest. She dressed with Cara tweed skirt, a lavender cardigan, and her second-best hat, adorned with a single silk rosand, set out along the winding path to the manor, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and as she passed the village green, she noted the furtive glances of passers-by. They expect an arrest any moment, she murmured to herself, her lips barely moving. But expectation is a poor substitute for evidence. Greystone Manor loomed ahead, its stone walls imposing yet weathered, like an aging sentinel grown tired of its watch. The gravel drive crunched under Miss Marple's sensible shoes as she approached the front door, where she was met by Jenny, the parlour-maid, whose round face was pinched with nervous exhaustion. "Oh, Miss Marple, Jenny," said, bobbing a curtsy, "it's ever so kind of you to call." "The house is all at 6s and 7s. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "I shan't stay long, my dear. Just a few magazines for Mrs. Baines, or the Major, whichever of them is about." Jenny hesitated, then ushered her into the hall, where the grandfather clock ticked with mournful regularity. The manor's interior was a study in faded opulence: polished oak panels, threadbare Persian rugs, and portraits of stern-faced Protheros gazing down from the walls. Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing the faint dust on a sideboard, suggesting Mrs. Baines's distraction, a half-open drawer in a console table, hinting at recent rummaging. Jenny led her to the morning room, a sunny space with tall windows overlooking the rose garden, and promised to fetch the housekeeper. Left alone, Miss Marple set her basket down and took in her A writing desk bore a jumble of papers and a silver cigarette case, engraved with the Colonel's initials, lay askew on a velvet cushion. A house in disarray, she thought, reflects a household in turmoil. Mrs. Clara Baines appeared. Moments later, her gaunt frame draped in a severe black dress that seemed to absorb the light. Her eyes, small and wary, flickered over Miss Marple with barely concealed irritation. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped. "Jenny says you've brought magazines." Miss Marple nodded, producing the bundle with a flourish. "For the charity drive, Mrs. Baines. I thought you might distribute them to the staff. Or perhaps Major Prothero would care to take a few." The housekeeper's lips thinned, but she accepted the magazines, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched them to her chest. Miss Marple noted the tremor, filing it away with the precision of a botanist cataloguing a new specimen. "Such a sad time for Greystone," Miss Marple said, her tone one of gentle sympathy. The Colonel was so much a part of the village. Mrs. Baines's expression hardened. "He was a great man," she said, "but not an easy one. He had his ways, and not everyone appreciated them." The words were a crack in her armor, and Miss Marple seized the opening. "I suppose Miss Vance found it difficult, living under his roof," she ventured. Mrs. Baines's eyes narrowed. "Miss Eleanor had her own ideas," she said tartly, "always reading her books, mooning about with that Dr. Gale. The Colonel didn't approve, and no wonder. A girl like that, with her air, she thought herself above us all." The venom in the housekeeper's voice was unmistakable, and Miss Marple's mind quickened. Resentment, she knew, could fester into something far darker, especially in a woman like Mrs. Baines, whose years of service had earned her little but drudgery. She recalled a similar figure from her youth, a governess in a grand house, her loyalty soured by slights, her actions ultimately ruinous. "It must be trying," Miss Marple said softly, "to manage a household with so many differing temperaments." Mrs. Baines sniffed, her composure returning. "I do my duty," she said, and excused herself to fetch Major Prothero, leaving Miss Marple alone once more. The morning room offered further clues. A photograph on the mantel showed the Colonel in military uniform, his jaw set, his eyes cold. Beside it stood a smaller frame, containing a faded image of a young woman, Lena's mother. Perhaps, given the resemblance in the delicate curve of the cheek. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the photograph, her thoughts drifting to family ties and their hidden strains. The Colonel's wealth, though diminished, had been a magnet for envy, and his decision to favour Eleanor in his will had clearly stirred unrest. But was it enough to drive someone to murder? Major Henry Prothero's arrival interrupted her reverie. He was a large man, his face flushed from too much sun or too much whiskey, his tweed jacket straining at the seams. "Miss Marple, is it?" he boomed, shaking her hand with unnecessary force. "Heard you're the village's resident sleuth, eh? Well, we've a devil of a mess here." His joviality was forced, and Miss Marple detected a nervous edge beneath it. "I'm only a visitor, Major," she demurred, "bringing magazines for the parish." But she allowed him to steer her to a sofa. Sensing his need to talk, the Major launched into a tirade about the Colonel's death, his words tumbling over one another like stones in a stream. "Lucius was a fool to trust that girl," he said, his voice rising. "Eleanor, with her pretty face and her scheming ways, she's had her eye on his money from the start. And now this will business. Cutting me out, after all I've done for the family." Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of polite interest, though her mind was dissecting his outburst. The Major's anger was genuine, But was it born of betrayal or guilt? She thought of a neighbour in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose bluster had masked a theft. The louder the protest, the deeper the secret. Miss Vance must be under great strain, Miss Marple said, steering the conversation gently. To lose her uncle so suddenly, and in such a way, the Major snorted. Strain, she's play-acting, if you ask me. Always was a sly one, twisting. Lucius round her finger. And that Dr. Gale mark, my words, he's in on it. A pair of vipers, the both of them. His words were venomous, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he feared his own vehemence. She made a mental note to explore Dr. Gale's role further, sensing a thread that connected Eleanor to the wider web of motives. The Major's wife, Lydia, joined them briefly, a pale woman with a nervous smile and hands that fluttered like trapped birds. She said little, murmuring agreement with her husband's complaints, but Miss Marple observed her closely. Lydia's eyes darted to the door whenever footsteps sounded in the hall, and her fingers twisted a handkerchief into knots. A woman afraid, Miss Marple thought, but of whom? Her husband, or something else? She recalled a case in a nearby villager wife whose silence had concealed a crime, her fear the key to unlocking it. Lydia excused herself quickly, claiming a headache, and Miss Marple filed her behaviour away for later consideration as the visit drew to a close. Mrs. Baines returned, her demeanour colder than before. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the Colonel had been troubled in his final weeks, convinced that someone was rifling through his private papers. He locked his study at night, she said, but he still fretted. Said he didn't trust anyone, not even Miss Eleanor. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Stolen papers suggested secrets worth killing for debts, perhaps, or indiscretions the Colonel wished to conceal. She thanked Mrs. Baines and the Major, promising to return with more magazines, and made her way back to the village, her basket lighter but her mind heavy with new questions, at home. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed as a backdrop to her thoughts. The morning's visit had confirmed her suspicions. Greystone Manor was a house divided, its inhabitants bound by resentment and mistrust. Major Henry's anger, Mrs. Baines's bitterness, Lydia's fearage was a piece of the puzzle, but none yet formed a complete picture. The Colonel's papers were a new element, one that hinted at a motive beyond inheritance. Had he uncovered a betrayal or harboured a secret that someone wished to keep buried? To test her theories, Miss Marple telephoned Mr. Pettigrew, the Colonel's solicitor, under the guise of inquiring about a church donation in the Colonel's memory. Pettigrew, a dry, precise man with a fondness for detail, was happy to chat. Colonel Prothero was a cautious client, he said, his voice crackling over the line. He came to me last month to revise his will, but he was agitated, kept saying he'd been betrayed by someone close. He even asked about securing his private documents, though he wouldn't say why. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Betrayal, she knew, was a powerful spur, capable of turning loyalty into lethal intent. As evening fell, Miss Marple lit her lamp and reviewed her findings. The family's secrets were beginning to surface, like weeds breaking through soil, Major. Henry's financial straits, Mrs. Baines's wounded pride, Lydia's unspoken dread, and the Colonel's paranoia over his papers all pointed to a household on the brink. Eleanor remained the focal point of suspicion, but Miss Marple was increasingly convinced that the thumb mark was a misdirection, a deliberate attempt to cast blame. She thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, a forged letter that had nearly ruined a young woman its true author unmasked only by a slip of the pen. The truth, she murmured, her needles clicking softly, is in the details. The village clock chimed 9, its notes drifting through the open window. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to make cocoa, her movements unhurried, but purposeful. Tomorrow she would seek out Dr. Simon Gale, whose name hovered like a spectre over Eleanor's fate. His devotion to the girl was clear, but devotion, Miss Marple knew, could mask darker impulses. As she stirred the cocoa, her thoughts turned to the Colonel's study, its locked drawers and hidden truths. Someone wanted something, she said to herself, and they wanted it badly enough to kill. With that, she sipped her drink, her mind already weaving the next steps in her quiet, relentless pursuit of justice. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Dilemma. The fourth morning since Colonel Lucius Prothero's death brought a soft drizzle to St. Mary Mead, the kind that clung to the hedgerows and dampened the spirits of even the most resolute villagers. The rain pattered against the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, where she sat with a cup of tea and her knitting, a half-finished mitt in muted green wool. The village remained gripped by the mystery at Greystone Manor, its chatter now a low hum of certainty. Eleanor Vance, with her delicate beauty and incriminating thumb mark, was guilty. Yet Miss Marple, her mild blue eyes fixed on the rain's garden, saw not a closed case but a tapestry of motives, each thread demanding careful untangling. Today, she resolved to examine one such thread. Dr. Simon Gale, the young physician whose name surfaced repeatedly in connection with Eleanor. Miss Marple's interest in Dr. Gale was not born of gossip alone, though the village provided plenty. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Bantry had whispered that the doctor was quite taken with Eleanor, his visits to Greystone more frequent than medical necessity warranted. At the church the previous evening, Miss Weatherby had hinted at a quarrel between the Colonel and his niece over that young man's attentions. These fragments, combined with Major Henry's accusations and Mrs. Baines's disdain, painted a picture of a suitor whose devotion might have consequences, perhaps dangerous ones. Miss Marple, who had seen love twist into obsession in her long observation of human nature, knew that such devotion could be a mask for darker impulses. She recalled a case from her youth in a neighbouring parisher curate's infatuation with a squire's daughter, ending in tragedy when his ardour turned to desperation. Love, she murmured to herself, setting her knitting aside, is a motive as old as Cain. Her opportunity to meet Dr. Gale came, as she had hoped, at the village fete, a modest affair held annually in the meadow behind the vicarage. Despite the drizzle, the fete proceeded with dogged cheer, its stalls draped in tarpaulins, its attendees huddled under umbrellas. Miss Marple, clad in a waterproof coat and her sturdiest boots, arrived early, her basket laden with jars of her celebrated gooseberry jam for the preserves table. The fete was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead, where every glance and whisper carried weight, and Miss Marple moved through it with the ease of a seasoned observer, her presence unremarkable, yet her senses attuned to every detail. Dr. Gale was there, as she had anticipated, manning a first-aid tent sponsored by the local Red Cross. He was a tall man of 30, with an open, handsome face and eyes that held a quiet intensity. His dark hair was damp from the rain, and his white coat, slightly too large, gave him a boyish air that belied his professional demeanour. Miss Marple approached under the pretext of inquiring about bandages for the church's emergency kit, her smile disarming. "Dr. Gale, I presume," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Jane Marple, just a village spinster with a fondness for good causes." The doctor smiled. his handshake firm but distracted, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. They chatted briefly about the fate, Miss Marple steering the conversation with the lightest touch. She mentioned the Colonel's death in passing, noting the doctor's quick intake of breath. "A dreadful shock for Miss Vance," she said, her tone one of gentle concern. "You must know her well, being the family's physician." Dr. Gale's expression softened, but his eyes grew guarded. "Eleanor Miss Vance's a remarkable woman," he said. "She's borne this ordeal with great courage, though the village hasn't made it easy." His voice held a trace of indignation, and Miss Marple noted the familiarity in his use of Eleanor's Christian name. Here was a man, she thought, whose feelings ran deep, perhaps too deep. She pressed gently, her questions cloaked in neighbourly interest. "I understand you treated the Colonel for gout," she said, recalling a detail from the inquest. "Such a painful condition, did it require anything unusual in the way of medication?" Dr. Gale hesitated, then nodded. "I prescribed arsenic, in small doses, as is standard for gout in some cases. It was carefully measured, of course, and kept in a locked cabinet at Greystone." His tone was professional, but Miss Marple detected a defensive edge. She thought of the arsenic found in the Colonel's portnot, a medicinal dose, but a lethal one. Could a mistake have been made, or was the doctor's prescription a convenient cover for something sinister? The conversation was interrupted by a child's crier. Boy had grazed his knee at the sack race. Dr. Gale excused himself to tend the injury, and Miss Marple watched him work, his hands steady as he cleaned the wound and applied a plaster. His care was genuine, his manner reassuring, yet she sensed a man under strain, his calm a veneer over some inner turmoil. As he returned, she shifted her approach, mentioning Eleanor's plight. "The village is quick to judge," she said, "but I wonder if Miss Vance has anyone to speak for her, besides yourself." Dr. Gale's face darkened. "She's innocent," he said fiercely. "I'd stake my life on it. Eleanor wouldn't harm a soul, least of all her uncle, no matter how they disagreed." The vehemence of his words struck Miss Marple, echoing the passion of a young man she had known decades ago, whose love for a married woman had led to a fatal duel. She probed further, her voice soft but insistent. "Disagreed? I hadn't realized. They were at odds." Dr. Gale flushed, realizing his slip. "It was nothing serious," he said quickly. "The Colonel was strict old-fashioned. He wanted Eleanor to marry someone of his choosing, not someone like me." His candor was unexpected, and Miss Marple seized it. "And you care for her deeply," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Dr. Gale met her gaze, his eyes raw with emotion. "More than anything," he said simply. The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Miss Marple thanked him for his time and moved on to the jam stall, her mind racing. Dr. Gale's devotion was undeniable, but it raised troubling questions. Had he acted to protect Eleanor, perhaps believing the Colonel's disapproval threatened her happiness? Or was his role more passive, his prescription merely a tool exploited by another? She thought of the thumb mark, its clarity still nagging at her. A lover might plant such a clue to shield his beloved door, to ensnare her, if his love had soured. The possibilities were as tangled as the skeins of wool in her basket. The fate provided further opportunities for observation. Miss Marple lingered near the tea tent, where Mrs. Clement was serving scones and gossip in equal measure. "Dr. Gale's been a godsend," Mrs. Clement confided, passing Miss Marple a cup. "But I worry for him. Eleanor's troubles weigh on him terribly." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. She spotted Major Henry Prothero by the tambola, his voice loud as he argued with a stallholder over a prize. His wife, Lydia, stood a few paces away, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple noted the distance between them, a silent rift that spoke volumes as the afternoon wore on. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement had invited a small group for tea. Eleanor was there, her presence subdued but composed, her dark eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of gratitude. Dr. Gale arrived shortly after, his manner solicitous as he took a seat beside Eleanor. Miss Marple watched their interaction, closely the way his hand brushed hers as he passed a plate, the way her smile warmed in his presence. It was a tableau of affection, yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension, as if each was protecting the other from an unspoken threat. Over tea, the conversation turned to the Colonel's death, despite Mrs. Clement's efforts to steer it elsewhere. Miss Weatherby, a sharp-tongued spinster, remarked on the thumb mark, her voice dripping with insinuation. "Such a clear print," she said, glancing at Eleanor. "One wonders how it got there." Eleanor's hand trembled, and Dr. Gale interjected, his tone sharp. "The police will find the truth," he said. "They always do." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the doctor's quick defence, his words a shield for Eleanor, perhaps for himself. She turned the talk to village matters, but her mind remained on Dr. Gale. His prescription of arsenic was a critical link, one that Inspector Slack had seized upon with his usual zeal. At the inquest, Slack had pressed the doctor on the drug storage, eliciting the admission that the Colonel's supply was kept in a cabinet to which several household members had access. Miss Marple wondered about that cabinet, its lock, its contents, its proximity to the study where the Colonel died. She made a mental note to examine it, perhaps during another visit to Greystone. As the tea party dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Mrs. Clement clear the cups. Alone with her friend, she broached the subject of Dr. Gale. "He seems a fine young man," she said, "but terribly burdened by Miss Vance's troubles." Mrs. Clement sighed. "He's devoted to her, Jane, but it's more than that. I think he blames himself for the arsenic, for not protecting her from the Colonel's temper. He told me once that he wished he'd confronted Lucius directly, instead of letting Eleanor bear the brunt." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A confrontation avoided could become a motive pursued, especially if the doctor felt Eleanor was in danger. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit her lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting a rhythmic counterpoint to her thoughts. Dr. Gale's dilemma was clear. A man in love, caught between duty and desire, his every action scrutinized by a village eager for a culprit. His arsenic prescription was a fact, but its misuse was a question. Had he been careless, or had someone else exploited his trust? She thought of the Colonel's study, its decanter of port, the glass with its telltale mark. The arsenic had been added after Eleanor poured the drink. She was certain otherwise. The thumb mark would not be so prominent. But by whom and why? Miss Marple's mind turned to parallels from her past. Years ago, in a market town not far from St. Mary Mead, a pharmacist's assistant had been accused of poisoning a customer, only for the true killer, a jealous rival, to be unmasked through a careless remark about a bottle's label. The smallest things, Miss Marple murmured, betray the largest truths. She considered Dr. Gale's character, his earnestness, his protectiveness, his moments of unease. He was no villain, she felt, but nor was he free of suspicion. His love for Eleanor could be his salvation or his undoing. The rain had stopped, and the night was still, save for the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple rose to close her curtains, her gaze lingering on the darkened village. Tomorrow she would visit the chemist, Mr. Hodges. To inquire about arsenic cells, a task she would frame as concern for her garden's pests. She would also seek another glimpse of Greystone's household, perhaps catching Mrs. Baines or Lydia. Unawares, the doctor's dilemma was but one piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to fit it into place, one careful observation at a time. Chapter 5. The Thumb Marks, Tales. The 5th day since Colonel Lucius Prothero's death draped St. Mary Mead in a soft autumn mist, the kind that blurred the edges of the village's cottages and lent an air of secrecy to its lanes. The mystery at Greystone Manor remained unresolved, a wound festering in the community's heart. Eleanor Vance, with the damning thumb mark on the poisoned glass, bore the brunt of suspicion, her every move dissected by neighbours eager for a scandal. Yet Miss Jane Marple, pruning her roses in the damp morning air, saw beyond the villagers' clamour. To her, the thumb mark was not a verdict, but a riddle, its clarity a provocation that demanded scrutiny. Today she resolved to unravel its tale, armed with nothing more than her sharp mind and a pretext as delicate as the mist itself. Miss Marple's cottage, with its neat garden and lace-curtained windows, was a sanctuary of order, a stark contrast to the chaos of Greystone's secrets. As she sipped her morning tea, her knitting idle for once, she reviewed the threads she had gathered. Major Henry's bluster, Mrs. Baines's resentment, Lydia's fear, Dr. Gale's devotion, and the Colonel's paranoia over his papers. Each suggested motives, but the thumb mark Eleanor's, yet oddly pristine, gnawed at her. It was too convenient, too staged, like a prop in a village play. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, where a forged signature had nearly ruined a schoolmaster, its perfection the very clue that betrayed its falsity. Truth, she murmured, setting her cup down, hides in the flaws. Her plan was twofold: to visit Greystone Manor's kitchen, where the fatal glass had been prepared, and to call on Mr. Hodges, the village chemist, to inquire about arsenic purchases. She dressed with her usual Cara grey wool dress, a shawl of soft mauve, and a hat adorned with a single feather, and packed her basket with a jar of her quince jelly, a plausible excuse for dropping by the manor. The mist clung to her coat as she walked. The village hushed, save for the clink of a milkman's bottles and the distant bark of a dog. At the post office, Mrs. Price leaned out, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "Inspector Slacks at Greystone. Again, Miss Marple. They say he's found something new about that thumb mark." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind quickened. New evidence, or new assumptions, she would see for herself. Greystone Manor appeared through the mist like a ship emerging from fog, its stone walls damp and sombre. Miss Marple rang the bell, and Jenny, the parlour-maid, answered, her eyes red-rimmed from fatigue or tears. "Oh, Miss Marple," Jenny said, wiping her hands on her apron, "it's good of you to come." "The place is like a tomb," Miss Marple offered the jelly, her smile disarming. "Just a small gift for the kitchen staff. My dear, might I have a word with you there? I'm collecting recipes for the church cookbook." The excuse was thin, but Jenny, too weary to question, led her to the kitchen. A cavernous room with a flagged floor and a vast iron range. The kitchen was empty save for Jenny, the cook having stepped out to the market. Miss Marple settled at the scrubbed oak table, her basket beside her, and encouraged Jenny to talk. The girl, grateful for a sympathetic ear, described the evening of the Colonel's death with halting detail. Miss Eleanor poured the port, like always, Jenny said, twisting her apron. She polished the glasses herself that day said she wanted them spotless for the Colonel's guests. I thought it odd, her doing my work, but she was kind like that. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Eleanor polishing the glasses was new, a detail that shifted the thumb mark's context. And where were the glasses kept? She asked, her tone casual. Jenny pointed to a cupboard near the pantry. There, in a tray. Miss Eleanor took one out, polished it, and filled it from the decanter in the study. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A polished glass should bear no smudges, yet the thumb mark was clear, almost deliberate. She rose, as if struck by a thought, and approached the cupboard, her movements unhurried. The tray held a dozen crystal glasses, their surfaces gleaming. She lifted one, examining it in the dim light, and noted its weight, its clarity. Such fine crystal, she said, but so easily marked. Jenny agreed, unaware of the question behind the remark. Miss Marple's suspicion grew. The thumb mark was not a careless error, but a calculated act, perhaps by someone who knew Eleanor's habits. She thanked Jenny, promising to include her scone recipe in the cookbook, and took her leave. Her basket lighter, but her thoughts heavier. Her next stop was the village chemist, a narrow shop with a bell that jangled as she entered. Mr. Hodges, a stooped man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted her warmly. Miss Marple, come about your slug powder, have you? She smiled, shaking her head. Not today, Mr. Hodges. I'm curious about arsenic. Purely for my roses. You understand, I've heard it's used for pests. But is it easily obtained? The chemist's face grew serious. Arsenic's tightly controlled, he said, but I did sell some last month, under a false name. The handwriting was sharp, angular like Mrs. Baines's, I thought, though I couldn't swear to it. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained bland. How curious, she said, and no one else asked for it. Hodges shook his head, and she thanked him, her mind weaving this new thread into the pattern. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire against the damp and settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as a counterpoint to her thoughts. The thumb mark's tail was taking shape, its clarity a deliberate misdirection. Eleanor's polishing of the glass suggested innocence Wymark, a glass she had cleaned. But it also opened the possibility that someone else had handled it after. The arsenic purchase, linked tentatively to Mrs. Baines, was another piece, though the housekeeper's motive remained elusive. Miss Marple thought of the Colonel's study, its decanter and locked drawers, and wondered if the poison had been added there under cover of the household's routines. To test her theories, she telephoned Inspector Slack, using the pretext of inquiring about a lost shawl from the Fate. Slack, brusque as ever, was at Greystone, and she managed to coax a detail from him. The glass, now in police custody, bore only the thumb mark, no other prints. It's as if it was wiped clean. Save for that one smudge, he grumbled. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. A wiped glass confirmed her suspicion. The thumb mark was planted, perhaps by someone with access to Eleanor's belongings, handkerchief, a glove, anything she had touched. She recalled a case from her youth where a stolen ring had been placed in a servant's room, its placement too perfect to be accidental. The guilty, she murmured, overreach in their cleverness. Her thoughts were interrupted by a visit from Griselda, Mrs. Clement's lively cousin, who burst in with a gust of damp air. Miss Marple, you'll never guess," Griselda exclaimed, shaking out her umbrella. "I overheard Mrs. Baines at the butcher's muttering about Eleanor, said she'd seen her sneaking into the Colonel's study the night before he died, looking at his papers." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. "Did she, now?" she said softly. Griselda nodded, oblivious to the significance. "Mrs. Baines thinks Eleanor was after something, money, maybe, or secrets." "Oh, it's all so thrilling." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was elsewhere, passing this new accusation. Was Mrs. Baines deflecting suspicion, or had Eleanor indeed been searching for something? The afternoon brought a chance to observe the household again. When Miss Marple attended a parish meeting at the vicarage, where Mrs. Baines was delivering flowers for the altar, the housekeeper's face was drawn, her movements jerky, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to Eleanor, who was helping with the hymnals. During a lull, Miss Marple approached, her tone one of gentle inquiry. "Mrs. Baines, I hear the Colonel was troubled about his papers. Did he ever mention anything to you?" The housekeeper stiffened, her hands clutching a vase. "He said someone was meddling," she replied curtly. "I told him to lock his desk, but he didn't always listen." Her voice held a note of accusation, and Miss Marple wondered if it was aimed at Eleanor or another. The meeting ended, and Miss Marple walked home, the mist now a faint veil over the village. She thought of the thumb mark, its tale one of deception rather than guilt. Someone had wanted Eleanor blamed, someone with access to the glass and knowledge of her habits. Mrs. Baines, with her angular handwriting and resentment, was a possibility, but her nervousness suggested fear rather than cunning. Major Henry, with his financial woes, had motive, but his bluster seemed ill-suited to such subtlety. Lydia's silence was troubling, her fear a potential clue. While Dr. Gale's devotion raised questions of loyalty pushed too far. Each was a suspect, yet none fit perfectly, like a key that turned but did not unlock. At home, Miss Marple lit her lamp and reviewed her notes, scribbled in a small notebook she kept for such purposes. The thumb mark, the arsenic, the papers each was a clue, but their connections remained elusive. She thought of the Colonel's character, his rigidity a catalyst for conflict. Had he discovered a betrayal, as Mr. Pettigrew suggested, or had his paranoia created enemies where none existed? She recalled a village scandal from years past, where a forged will had sparked a murder, the true culprit revealed by a misplaced pen. Details, she said to herself, are the map to truth. As evening deepened, Miss Marple prepared a simple supper: poached egg on toast, a habit from her frugal youth, and let her mind wander. The thumb mark's tale was one of intent, a deliberate act to shift blame. She pictured the study, the glass on the desk, the decanter gleaming in the lamplight. Someone had added the arsenic after Eleanor's touch, someone who knew the households rhythms. She made a mental note to revisit Greystone, perhaps to examine the study itself, and to watch Lydia more closely. Her fear was a thread yet to be pulled. The village clock chimed 10, its notes soft through the mist. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to close her curtains, her gaze lingering on the darkened lane. The thumb mark had told its tale, but the story was incomplete, its ending hidden in the shadows of Greystone's secrets. With her quiet resolve, Miss Marple vowed to find it, one careful step at a time. Chapter 6. A Jealous Heart. The 6th day following Colonel Lucius Prothero's poisoning cast St. Mary Mead in a pale, watery light, the sun struggling through a veil of high clouds that hinted at rain. The village, though outwardly calm with its daily rituals chimney smoke curling upward, the clatter of a delivery van, the laughter of children at the school gate remained, taut with the unresolved tension of Greystone Manor's tragedy. Eleanor Vance, branded by the thumb mark on the fatal glass, bore the village's suspicion like a heavy cloak, her innocence a matter of faith for few beyond Dr. Simon Gale. Miss Jane Marple, however, pruning her lavender with delicate precision, saw the case not as a closed book but as a labyrinth, its paths converging on motives buried deep in human frailty. Today, her focus turned to Major Henry Prothero, whose bluster and bitterness suggested a jealous heart, a motive as old as murder itself. Miss Marple's cottage, with its tidy hearth and scent of beeswax polish, was a haven where her thoughts could unfold like the petals of her prized roses. As she sipped her morning tea, her knitting set aside, she reflected on the threads she had gathered, the planted thumb mark, the arsenic link to Mrs. Baines's handwriting, the Colonel's missing papers, Dr. Gale's protective devotion, and Lydia's silent fear. Major Henry, the Colonel's cousin, had emerged as a volatile figure, his loud accusations against Eleanor masking a deeper grievance. His financial straits, exacerbated by the Colonel's decision to favour Eleanor in his will, pointed to a man driven by envy, a passion Miss Marple knew that could curdle into violence. She recalled a long-ago scandal in a nearby village, where a brother's jealousy over an inheritance had led to a fatal fall, the truth uncovered only by a misplaced ledger. "Jealousy," she murmured, setting her cup down, "is a spark that needs little kindling." Her plan was to observe Major Henry in his element, away from Greystone's stifling walls. The Red Lion, the village's sole pub, was his haunt, where he held court with tales of military glory and complaints about his lot. Miss Marple enlisted her nephew Raymond, a writer with a knack for blending into any crowd, to accompany her under the guise of treating him to lunch. She dressed with Cara navy dress with a cameo brooch, a coat of soft grey, and a hat adorned with a sprig of heather, and met Raymond at the pub's oak-beamed entrance, its sign creaking faintly in the breeze. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said, his eyes twinkling, "I suspect you're up to more than shepherd's pie." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "My dear, I only wish to enjoy your company and, perhaps over here, a word or two." The Red Lion was a cosy warren of low ceilings and worn tables, its air thick with the scent of ale and wood smoke. Major Henry was already there, ensconced in a corner with a pint and a group of locals, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation. Miss Marple and Raymond took a table nearby, close enough to listen but far enough to avoid notice. She ordered tea and a slice of fruitcake, her attention fixed on the Major's florid face as he railed against Eleanor. "That girl's a viper," he declared, slamming his glass down. "Wrapped Lucius round her finger, got him to change his will, my will, I might add, and now he's dead, and she's sitting pretty. If that's not motive, I'm a Dutchman." The locals nodded, eager for drama, but Miss Marple noted the Major's bloodshot eyes, his unsteady hand. Here was a man unravelling, his anger a mask for something raw, for perhaps, or guilt. Raymond, ever obliging, engaged the barman in idle chat, leaving Miss Marple to observe. She sipped her tea, her ears attuned to the Major's tirade. He spoke of the Colonel's wealth, his own loyalty to the family, and Eleanor's scheming with Dr. Gale. "They're in it together," he said, his voice slurring. "Mark my words, the doctors know Saint mixing poisons for his sweetheart, I'll bet." The accusation was reckless, and Miss Marple wondered if it stemmed from genuine belief or a need to deflect suspicion. She thought of a case from her youth, where a farmer's loud accusations against a rival had concealed his own theft, his bluster a shield until a stray receipt betrayed him. The loudest voice, she mused, often hides the deepest secret. The Major's companions drifted away, leaving him alone with his pint. Miss Marple seized the moment, approaching under the pretext of inquiring about a church fundraiser. Major Prothero, she said, her tone warm. I do hope you're bearing up under this dreadful time. The Major blinked momentarily, disarmed by her presence. Miss Marple, isn't it? He said, his voice gruff. Bearing up as best I can, with that girl making a fool of us all. She settled across from him, her basket at her feet, and let him talk, her gentle prompts drawing out his grievances like thread from a spool. He spoke bitterly of the Colonel's decision to alter his will, a change that left him with a pittance, while Eleanor inherited the estate. I'm family, bloodkin, he said, his fist thumping the table. I stood by Lucius through his tantrums, his debt's years of it. And for what? To be cast aside for a slip of a girl who batted her eyes. His anger was palpable, but Miss Marple detected a note of desperation, as if he feared more than financial loss. She probed gently, mentioning the Colonel's papers. I heard he was troubled about documents going missing, she said. Did he confide in you? The Major's face darkened. He mentioned it, he said curtly. Said someone was snooping Eleanor, most likely, after his money. I told him to lock his desk, but he was too stubborn. The conversation shifted to Greystone's household, and Miss Marple noted the Major's disdain for Mrs. Baines, a nosy old crow, and his vague sympathy for Lydia, his wife. She's a good sort, Lydia, he said, but weak. Lets things fester. His words were dismissive, yet Miss Marple sensed a tension, as if Lydia's silence weighed on him. She thanked him, promising to mention the fundraiser at the manor, and rejoined Raymond, who had gleaned little from the barman beyond the Major's mounting debts. He's in deep with the bookies, Raymond said, as they left the pub. No wonder he's sore about the will. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving this new thread into the pattern. Her next move was a visit to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was hosting a sewing circle, an ideal setting to observe Lydia Prothero. Miss Marple arrived with a bundle of fabric scraps, her excuse for joining the group. The vicarage parlour was a haven of chatter and needlework, with Lydia seated in a corner, her head bent over a patchwork square. Her hands moved mechanically, her face pale, her eyes avoiding the others. Miss Marple took a chair nearby, her own needle flashing as she worked on a cushion cover, her attention fixed on Lydia's subtle cues, the way her lips tightened when Eleanor's name was mentioned, the faint tremor in her fingers as she threaded her needle. During a lull, Miss Marple engaged Lydia in quiet conversation, her questions cloaked in neighbourly concern. You must find Greystone so trying now, she said, with all this sorrow. Lydia's smile was brittle. It's difficult, she said, her voice barely audible. Henry's upset, and I try to keep the peace. Her words were vague, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting an interruption. She recalled a woman from a past case, whose nervous glances had betrayed her knowledge of a crime, her silence a shield for another's. Guilt. Henry is fortunate to have you, Miss Marple said, though I imagine his temper makes it challenging. Lydia's hands stilled. He's passionate, she said softly, but he means no harm. The defense was weak, and Miss Marple sensed a deeper truth lurking beneath. The sewing circle broke up, and Miss Marple lingered, helping Mrs. Clement tidy the room. Alone with her friend, she broached the subject of Lydia. She seems terribly strained, Miss Marple said, stacking teacups. Mrs. Clement sighed. Poor Lydia's always been in Henry's shadow. I think she resents Eleanor not for the will, but for her youth, her prospects. Henry's rages don't help. They make her withdraw even more. Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. Resentment, she knew, could be as potent as jealousy, especially in a woman like Lydia, whose quiet demeanor might conceal a fierce inner life. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit her fire and settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as a backdrop to her thoughts. Major Henry's jealous heart was a vivid thread, his anger over the will a plausible motive. Yet his recklessness at the Red Lion suggested a man more likely to bluster than to plot, his drunken accusations lacking the subtlety of the thumb mark's deception. Lydia, however, was a puzzled her fear, her reticence, her possible envy. Of Eleanor, could she have acted to secure her husband's inheritance, or to punish the girl who eclipsed her? Miss Marple thought of a case from her youth, where a wife's quiet vengeance had appended a household, her motive rooted in years of overlooked slights. The heart, she murmured, is a labyrinth of its own. To test her theories, Miss Marple telephoned Mr. Pettigrew, the Colonel's solicitor, under the guise of clarifying a parish donation. Pettigrew, ever precise, mentioned the Major's debts in passing. Henry came to me last year, asking for a loan against his expected inheritance, he said. Lucius refused, said he'd squandered enough. It caused a rift. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. A rift could fester into murder, especially if the Major saw Eleanor as the obstacle to his salvation. But the thumb mark required finesse, a quality she doubted in Henry's unsteady hands. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, delivering a loaf and a scrap of gossip. Heard Major Henry at the Red Lion again, Miss Tommy said, his eyes wide. He was shouting about Dr. Gale, saying he's hiding something about the arsenic. Miss Marple tipped him a penny, her mind turning to the doctor. Henry's accusations were scattershot, but they reinforced her suspicion that the thumb mark was a diversion, pointing to Eleanor while shielding the true culprit. She made a mental note to revisit Dr. Gale, whose role in the arsenic's procurement remained a critical link. As evening fell, Miss Marple prepared a simple supper, lentil soup and a slice of the fresh loaf of thoughts circling the jealous heart at Greystone's core. Major Henry's envy was clear, but Lydia's quiet resentment was equally compelling. Her fear a potential key to the truth. The thumb mark, the arsenic, the missing papers all pointed to a calculated act, one that required access and opportunity. She pictured the study, its decanter gleaming, the glass carefully placed. Someone had watched, waited, and struck, their jealousy a silent spur. The village clock chimed 9, its notes drifting through the still air. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to draw her curtains, her gaze lingering on the darkened lane. Major Henry's jealous heart had revealed much, but the puzzle remained incomplete, its pieces scattered among Greystone's fractured household. With her quiet tenacity, Miss Marple vowed to gather them, one careful observation at a time, until the truth stood clear in the pale light of justice. Chapter 7. The Housekeeper's Confession. The 7th day since Colonel Lucius Prothero's poisoning dawned with a brittle clarity in St. Mary Mead, the autumn air sharp and the sky a pale, unyielding blue. The village, though outwardly serene, with its morning routines, the milkman's whistle, the rustle of leaves swept from doorsteps, carried a weight of unease. The mystery at Greystone Manor, a shadow that refused to lift. Eleanor Vance remained the focal point of suspicion. The thumb mark on the poisoned glass, a silent accusation that the village accepted with grim certainty. Yet Miss Jane Marple, arranging a vase of late-blooming asters in her cottage's parlour, saw the case as a delicate mosaic, its pieces jealousy, fear, and hidden truth set to form a complete picture. Today, her attention turned to Mrs. Clara Baines, the housekeeper whose angular handwriting and simmering resentment hinted at secrets to long-suppressed Miss Marple's cottage, with its polished furniture and scent of lavender, was a sanctuary, where her thoughts could align like the neat rows of her garden. As she sipped her morning tea, her knitting idle on the table, she reviewed the threads she had woven, the thumb mark's deliberate placement, Major Henry's envious rage, Lydia's quiet fear, Dr. Gale's protective fervour, and the Colonel's missing papers. Mrs. Baines, with her pinched face and furtive manner, was a figure of growing interest. The chemist's mention of her handwriting on an arsenic purchase, coupled with her access to the Colonel's study, made her a plausible suspect. Yet her nervous demeanour suggested a woman caught in a web not entirely of her making. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth in a neighbouring parish, where a servant's confession of theft had masked a greater crime, her fear the key to unlocking the truth. The guilty, she murmured, setting her cup down, often betray themselves in their silences. Her opportunity to probe Mrs. Baines came through the church's flower-ranging committee, a weekly gathering where the housekeeper was a reluctant but dutiful participant. Miss Marple, armed with a basket of chrysanthemums and a pretext of needing advice on altar displays, arrived at the church hall early. Her appearance unassuming, a grey shawl, a simple dress, and a hat with a modest velvet bow. The hall was a cool, echoing space, its stone walls adorned with faded hymn-boards, and the air carried the faint must of old prayer books. Mrs. Baines was already there, arranging lilies with mechanical precision, her thin lips pressed into a line. Miss Marple approached, her smile warm but her eyes keen. "Mrs. Baines, how lovely your flowers look," she said, setting her basket down. "I do hope you'll share your secrets. I'm hopeless with stems." The housekeeper glanced up, her expression wary but softened by the compliment. "It's no secret, Miss Marple," she said, her voice flat. "Just patience and a steady hand." Miss Marple nodded, joining her at the table, her fingers deftly sorting blooms as she eased into conversation. She spoke of the village, the weather, the Colonel's death-itch topic, a gentle probe, testing the housekeeper's defences. Mrs. Baines's responses were curt, but Miss Marple detected a tremor in her hands, a flicker in her eyes when name arose. "Such a trial for Greystone," Miss Marple said, clipping a stem, "and for you, managing the household through it all." Mrs. Baines's lips twitched. "I do what's needed," she said, "though some make it harder than others." The opening was slight, but Miss Marple seized it, her tone one of sympathetic curiosity. "Miss Vance, I suppose, must be a challenge," she ventured. "I hear she and the Colonel often clashed." Mrs. Baines's hands stilled, her knuckles whitening around a pair of shears. "Clashed," she said, her voice sharp. "That girl was a thorn in his side, always defying him, flaunting her ways with that doctor. The Colonel deserved better, after all he did for her." The bitterness was raw, and Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Baines's eyes darted to the door, as if fearing eavesdroppers. Here was a woman, she thought, whose loyalty to the Colonel had twisted into something fiercer, perhaps dangerous. She pressed gently, her questions cloaked in concern. It must have been difficult, she said, serving a man like the Colonel, with his exacting standards. Mrs. Baines's composure cracked, her voice rising. Difficult. It was my life, Miss Marple, 20 years of it, keeping Greystone running, while he doted on that girl. And what thanks did I get? Nothing but her airs and his temper. The outburst was sudden, and Mrs. Baines seemed to catch herself, her face flushing as she bent over the lilies. Miss Marple, her expression unchanged, filed the confession away. Resentment, she knew, could fester into action, especially in a woman who felt her sacrifices ignored. She recalled a housekeeper from a long-ago case, whose envy of a favoured ward had led to sabotage, her guilt betrayed by a trembling voice. The other women arrived, their chatter filling the hall, and Miss Marple shifted the talk to floral arrangements, giving Mrs. Baines time to recover. Yet she watched closely, noting the housekeeper's distracted air, the way her fingers fumbled with a ribbon. As the session ended, Miss Marple lingered, offering to help tidy the vases. Alone with Mrs. Baines, she broached the subject of the arsenic, her tone one of idle curiosity. "I was at Mr. Hodges's shop yesterday," she said, "and he mentioned an odd purchase of arsenic, something about handwriting like yours. How curious these things are." Mrs. Baines froze, her eyes wide with panic. "Handwriting," she stammered. I bought arsenic, yes, but for rats in the cellar. The Colonel ordered it. I'd never use it for harm." The confession came in a rush, tears welling in Mrs. Baines's eyes. She sank onto a chair, her hands wringing her apron. "I swear, Miss Marple, I only did what he asked. The rats were a plague, and he wouldn't have traps said they were cruel. I signed for it, but I didn't think. Not till the police started asking." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple, her face a mask of sympathy, patted her arm. There, she said, "you've done nothing wrong by following orders." But her mind was racing. The arsenic purchase was real, but Mrs. Baines's fear suggested she suspected its misuse perhaps by another, or perhaps by her own hand in a moment of weakness. Miss Marple thought of a village scandal years past, where a maid's confession of petty theft had unravelled a murder. Her fear the thread that led to the truth. She probed further, her questions gentle but precise. "Did you keep the arsenic in the study, where the Colonel might have used it?" Mrs. Baines shook her head. "No, in the pantry, locked away. Only I had the key, but the cabinet's old, the lock's loose. Anyone could have got at it." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the implication. Access was not exclusive. Despite the housekeeper's claim, she asked about the thumb mark, framing it as village gossip. "They say Miss Vance's print was on the glass," she said, "but I wonder how it got there, with so many hands in the house." Mrs. Baines's lips tightened. "She poured the port," she said, "but I saw her polish that glass like it was her pride. If you ask me, someone's playing tricks, someone who wanted her blamed." The suggestion was new, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Mrs. Baines, for all her resentment, seemed to doubt Eleanor's guilt, pointing instead to a hidden hand. Was this a genuine insight, or a deflection from her own involvement? Miss Marple thanked her, promising discretion, and left the hall, the chrysanthemums a bright contrast to the weight of her thoughts. The housekeeper's confession had clarified little but revealed much. Her loyalty to the Colonel, her envy of Eleanor, and her fear of the arsenic's true purpose. Miss Marple pictured the pantry cabinet, its loose lock a silent invitation to mischief, and wondered who had seized it. Her next move was to revisit Greystone Manor under the pretext of delivering a church newsletter. The manor's drive was slick with fallen leaves, and Jenny, answering the door, looked more haggard than ever. "Mrs. Baines is in the kitchen," she said, "but she's in a state bin, crying all morning." Miss Marple nodded, her basket heavy with the newsletter and a small pot of her damson jam, a gesture to soften her intrusion. The kitchen was warmer today, the range glowing, but Mrs. Baines was absent, replaced by the cook, a stout woman kneading dough with vigour. Miss Marple left the jam and newsletter, asking Jenny to show her the pantry, feigning interest in its storage for the church's harvest festival. The pantry was a dim, narrow space, its shelves lined with jars and tins. The cabinet, as Mrs. Baines had described, was a sturdy oak affair, its lock indeed worn, the key dangling from a hook nearby. Miss Marple examined it, her fingers brushing the wood, and noted its accessibility. Anyone in the household could have opened it, from Major Henry to Lydia to Dr. Gale during his visits. She thanked Jenny, her mind turning to the arsenic's journey from pantry to port. The thumb mark, she was certain, was a later addition, placed to ensure Eleanor's blame. She recalled a case from her youth where a poisoned cake had been traced to a shared larder, the true culprit unmasked by a smudged label. "Access," she murmured, "is the key to opportunity." Back in the village, Miss Marple stopped at the post office, where Mrs. Price was eager to share the latest. "Inspector Slack's been asking about Mrs. Baines," she said, leaning over the counter. "Says that arsenic purchase looks fishy, but she's sticking to her rat story." Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland, but her thoughts quickened. Slack's focus on Mrs. Baines was predictable, but it risked missing the wider web. She made a mental note to speak with him, perhaps to nudge his inquiries toward the pantry's lock or the studies deckened at home. Miss Marple lit her fire and settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as a rhythmic backdrop to her reflections. Mrs. Baines's confession was a pivotal thread, revealing her access to the arsenic and her resentment of Eleanor, yet her fear suggested she was not the mastermind. The housekeeper's role, Miss Marple suspected, was peripheral, a tool, perhaps for another's scheme. She pictured the study, its glass gleaming on the desk, the thumb mark a silent accusation. Someone had planned this, someone with patience and guile, using Mrs. Baines's purchase as a convenient scapegoat to test her theories. Miss Marple telephoned Mrs. Clement, inquiring about the vicarage's rat problem to gauge the plausibility of Mrs. Baines's excuse. "Oh, we've had traps for years," Mrs. Clement said. "Arsenic's old-fashioned, too dangerous with food." About Miss Marple thanked her, her suspicion growing. If rats were not a pressing issue, why had Mrs. Baines bought the poison? Was it truly at the Colonel's behest, or a cover for her own intent or another's? She thought of Lydia, whose fear seemed to deepen with each encounter, and wondered if her silence hid knowledge of the arsenic's true purpose. Her thoughts were interrupted by a visit from Griselda, who arrived with a basket of apples and a fresh wave of gossip. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe it," she said, flopping into a chair. "I heard at the fete that Mrs. Baines was seen arguing with the Colonel the day before he died, something about her wages." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. "Was she, now?" she said softly. Griselda nodded, oblivious to the significance. "They say she was furious, felt cheated after all her years." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was elsewhere, weaving this new thread into the pattern. An argument over wages could stoke resentment, but was it enough to kill? As evening fell, Miss Marple prepared a simple supper, vegetable broth and a slice of bread, her thoughts circling the housekeeper's confession. Mrs. Baines's role was clearer now, a woman wronged, her loyalty tested, her arsenic purchase a potential weapon. Yet the thumb mark's precision pointed to a colder mind, one that had used her as a pawn. Miss Marple pictured the household, Major Henry's debts, Lydia's fear, Dr. Gale's love, Eleanor's innocence, and wondered who had orchestrated the deception. She recalled a village murder from years past, where a servant's confession had led to a mastermind, the true killer hidden behind a veil of loyalty. The heart, she murmured, betrays itself in what it omits. The village clock chimed 10, its notes soft in the crisp air. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to close her curtains, her gaze lingering on the darkened lane. Mrs. Baines's confession had illuminated one corner of the mystery, but the shadows remained deep, concealing a truth that required patience to uncover. With her quiet resolve, Miss Marple vowed to press on, one careful step at a time, until the mosaic of Greystone's secrets lay bare. Chapter 8. The trap is set, the 8th day since Colonel Lucius Prothero's poisoning bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden autumn glow, the leaves of the elms and oaks blazing against a sky of unblemished blue. The village, with its neat gardens and chimneys trailing lazy smoke, seemed a picture of tranquility. Yet beneath this serene surface, the mystery at Greystone Manor pulsed like a hidden wound. Eleanor Vance, burdened by the thumb mark's accusation, remained the village's chosen culprit, her fate debated in hushed tones at the grocer's and the tea shop. But Miss Jane Marple, polishing her silver teapot in the quiet of her cottage, saw the case as a delicate puzzle, its pieces jealousy, resentment, fear, and deception nearing alignment. Today, she resolved to set a trap, a subtle maneuver to coax the truth from Greystone's tangled web of motives. Miss Marple's parlour, with its chintz curtains and scent of dried lavender, was a haven where her thoughts could crystallize. As she sipped her morning tea, her knitting idle on the table, she reviewed the threads she had gathered, the thumb mark's calculated placement, Major Henry's envious outbursts, Mrs. Baines's arsenic purchase, Dr. Gale's fervent loyalty, Lydia's silent dread, and the Colonel's missing papers. Mrs. Baines's tearful confession had been a turning point, revealing her access to the poison but suggesting she was a pawn, not a mastermind. The thumb mark, Miss Marple was certain, was a deliberate misdirection, its clarity a taunt to mislead. She recalled a case from her youth in a nearby town, where a staged theft had framed an innocent man, the true culprit unmasked by a slip in their own deception. The guilty, she murmured, setting her teapot down, weave their own snares. Her plan was bold, yet delicate, to gather the Greystone household at her cottage under the guise of a tea party, claiming she had uncovered a vital clue about the thumb mark. The invitation would be casual, framed as a gesture of village goodwill, but its true purpose was to observe reactions, to nudge the guilty into revealing themselves through a glance, a word, or a falter. Miss Marple knew the power of suggestion, how it could unsettle even the most guarded. She enlisted Mrs. Clement's help to extend the invitations, ensuring Eleanor, Dr. Gale, Major Henry, Lydia, and Mrs. Baines would attend. A small gathering. She told Mrs. Clement over the telephone to ease the tension at Greystone. Mrs. Clement, ever kind, agreed, unaware of the trap being set. Miss Marple prepared with care, baking a batch of her renowned shortbread and arranging her parlour. For intimacy, a round table draped in lace, her best china, and a vase of late roses as a centerpiece. She dressed simply, a dove-grey dress, a pearl brooch, and a hat she kept for special occasions, its brim adorned with a discreet spray of forget-me-nots. The cottage gleamed, its windows sparkling, its air warm with the scent of baking. Yet, beneath this homely facade, Miss Marple's mind was a steel trap, her every move calculated to draw out the truth. She placed a small notebook on the table, its pages blank but suggestive, a prop to imply she held evidence she did not yet possess. The guests arrived at 4 o'clock, their faces a study in contrasts. Eleanor, pale but composed, clung to Dr. Gale's arm, his protective presence a shield against the villagers' whispers. Major Henry, his face flushed, exuded forced joviality, while Lydia, at his side, was a shadow, her eyes downcast, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. Mrs. Baines entered last, her gaunt frame rigid, her gaze darting as if expecting an ambush. Miss Marple greeted them with her usual warmth, ushering them to the table with offers of tea and shortbread. "Such a sad time for Greystone," she said, pouring from her silver pot, "but I thought a quiet gathering might lift us, perhaps shed light on this dreadful affair." The room grew still, the clink of teacups the only sound. Miss Marple let the silence linger, her eyes moving from face to face, noting Eleanor's tight smile, Dr. Gale's clenched jaw, Major Henry's restless fingers, Lydia's faint flush, and Mrs. Baines's rigid posture. She began with village pleasantries, the harvest festival, the church choir, but soon turned to the Colonel's death, her tone one of gentle regret. "I've been thinking about that thumb mark," she said, her voice clear, "the one on the glass. It's troubled me, you see, because it's almost too perfect." She paused, letting the words settle, her gaze sweeping the table. Eleanor's breath caught, and Dr. Gale's hand tightened on his cup. But it was Lydia whose reaction stood out, a subtle tightening of her lips, a flicker of panic in her eyes. Miss Marple pressed on, her tone deceptively mild. "I've seen such things before, in the village. A mark placed deliberately to point the finger elsewhere. It's clever, but it requires a certain audacity." She reached for her notebook, opening it as if to consult a note, though the pages were blank. "I believe someone in this household knew exactly how to make that mark, using something Miss Vance had touched, a glove, perhaps, or a cloth." The suggestion was a spark, and she watched its effect. Major Henry scoffed, his voice loud. "Nonsense. The girl's guilty, plain as day." Dr. Gale bristled, his voice sharp. "That's slander, Major, and you know it." Mrs. Baines's hands trembled, spilling tea, while Eleanor sat frozen, her eyes wide. But Lydia's hands were still, too still, her face a mask of control that betrayed her effort to maintain it. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but piercing. "I've been thinking of a case from years ago, here in St. Mary Mead. A wife, overlooked, jealous of another's favour. She framed her rival, using a stolen brooch, but her own fear gave her away." She let the parallel hang, her eyes locking briefly with Lydia's. The woman's flush deepened, her handkerchief now a crumpled knot in her lap. Miss Marple continued, weaving her trap tighter. "Jealousy is a poison, deadlier than arsenic. It festers in silence, in the heart of someone who feels eclipsed by youth, by prospects, by love." She paused, sipping her tea, her calm a stark contrast to the tension around her. The room crackled with unspoken accusations. Major Henry blustered about Eleanor's scheming, but his words lacked conviction, as if he sensed the scrutiny shifting. Mrs. Baines murmured about rats and innocence. her voice thin with strain. Dr. Gale defended Eleanor, his passion bordering on desperation, while Eleanor herself remained silent, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple with a mix of hope and dread. Lydia, however, was the pivot, her silence louder than words, her composure fraying at the edges. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers pressed into her palms, leaving faint red marks, a sign of inner turmoil she could no longer hide to push further. Miss Marple mentioned the arsenic, framing it as village gossip. They say it was bought under a false name, she said, but the handwriting was telling. Not Miss Vance's, I think, but someone with access to the pantry and the study. Mrs. Baines gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But Lydia's reaction was subtler, faint intake of breath, a glance toward the door. Miss Marple pressed her advantage, her voice now edged with authority. The glass was wiped clean, save for that one mark. Someone wanted Miss Vance blamed, someone who knew her habits, her touch. It was a cruel trick, but not flawless. She closed her notebook with a snap, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Lydia's control snapped. Enough, she cried, her voice trembling, her teacup clattering in its saucer. You don't know, you can't know. The outburst drew every eye, and Miss Marple, her expression serene, leaned forward. My dear, she said gently, if you know something, it's best to speak. The truth has a way of surfacing, with or without our help. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, her hands shaking as she rose, her handkerchief falling to the floor. I can't, she whispered, and fled to the hall, her footsteps echoing on the oak floor. The room erupted in chaos. Major Henry roared. After her, his face purple, while Dr. Gale moved to comfort Eleanor, whose face was ashen. Mrs. Baines sat rigid, her lips moving silently, as if in prayer. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded, her mind racing. Lydia's reaction was the crack she had hoped for, a sign that the trap had found its mark. She rose, excusing herself to follow Lydia, her steps measured but purposeful. In the hall, she found the woman slumped on a bench, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Miss Marple sat beside her, her voice soft. Mrs. Prothero, you've carried a heavy burden. Let me help you. Lydia's head jerked up, her eyes wild with fear. You don't understand, she said, her voice hoarse. I didn't mean it wasn't supposed to happen. The words were a confession, incomplete but damning, and Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone one of quiet compassion. Tell me, my dear, what wasn't supposed to happen? Lydia's resistance crumbled, her words tumbling out like stones. From a broken dam, it was the will, she said, her voice barely audible. Henry was so angry, said we'd be ruined, left with nothing. I couldn't bear it, not after all we'd endured. Eleanor, she had everything, youth, beauty, his favor. I hated her for it. She paused, her breath ragged. I took the arsenic from the pantry. Clara's key was always there. I only meant to make him ill, to change his mind about the will. But it was too much. And then he was dead. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple, her heart heavy, placed a hand on her arm, and the thumb mark. She asked softly. Lydia nodded, tears streaming. I used her glove from the hall. I thought it would point to her, just for a while, till we were safe. The confession was complete, its weight a release for Lydia, but a burden for Miss Marple, who saw the tragedy of a woman driven by envy to destroy what she sought to preserve. She guided Lydia back to the parlor, where the others waited, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. Inspector Slack, summoned by a discreet call from Mrs. Clement, arrived shortly after, his notebook at the ready. Lydia, now calm in her despair, repeated her confession, her voice steady as she faced the consequences. Major Henry, stunned, protested his ignorance, his bluster reduced to a hollow echo. Eleanor, tears in her eyes, clasped Dr. Gale's hand, her relief tempered by sorrow. Mrs. Baines, silent, seemed to shrink, her role as unwitting accomplice a bitter truth. Miss Marple, her trap sprung, felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of justice served. She thanked her guests, her hospitality a stark contrast to the drama it had unveiled. As they dispersed, she lingered in her parlour, the roses wilting slightly in their vase. She thought of Lydia's jealous heart, its poison not just in the arsenic but in the years of resentment that had fueled it. She recalled a village tragedy from decades past, where a sister's envy had led to betrayal, the truth revealed only by a chance confession. Human nature, she murmured, is its own undoing. Back in her armchair, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the green mitt growing under her fingers. The trap had worked, but the case was not closed. Details remained, questions of the papers, of Henry's true ignorance. She made a mental note to speak with Slack, to ensure Lydia's confession was fully explored. The village clock chimed 6, its notes soft in the golden evening. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to prepare supper-coddled eggs and toast, a simple meal for a complex day. The trap was set, the truth laid bare, but Greystone's shadows lingered, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, would see them dispelled, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 9. The Truth Unveiled, the 9th day since Colonel Lucius. Prothero's poisoning dawned over St. Mary Mead with a crisp clarity, the autumn sun gilding the village's thatched roofs and casting long shadows across its cobbled lanes. The tumult of the previous day's revelations at Miss Jane Marple's cottage had sent ripples through the community, transforming whispers of suspicion into gasps of disbelief. Lydia Prothero's confession, her admission to poisoning the Colonel out of jealousy over his will and framing. Eleanor Vance, with a thumb mark had shattered the facade of Greystone Manor's household. Yet, for Miss Marple, tending her late-blooming dahlias in the soft morning light, the case was not fully resolved. Loose threads remained, questions of intent and complicity that demanded her meticulous attention. Today, she would ensure the truth was fully unveiled, its every facet laid bare like the petals of her carefully nurtured blooms. Miss Marple's cottage, with its polished oak furniture and scent of dried herbs, was a sanctuary where her thoughts could align with the precision of her knitting stitches. As she sipped her morning tea, her needles idle for the moment, she reviewed the mosaic she had pieced together, the thumb mark's deliberate deception, Major Henry's financial desperation, Mrs. Baines's unwitting role in the arsenic purchase, Dr. Simon Gale's fierce loyalty to Eleanor, and Lydia's corrosive envy. Lydia's tearful confession had been the keystone, revealing a woman driven by resentment to murder. Yet Miss Marple sensed gaps, details of the Colonel's papers, the extent of Henry's knowledge, and the precise mechanics of the crime. She recalled a case from her youth in a neighbouring village, where a confession had seemed complete until a hidden accomplice was uncovered, the truth emerging only through relentless probing. The truth, she murmured, setting her cup down, is like a garden. It requires constant tending. Her first task was to confer with Inspector Slack, whose brusque efficiency, though often misdirected, could be useful in tying up loose ends. She telephoned the police station in Much Benham, framing her call as a follow-up on the parish's lost and found. A pretext Slack tolerated with ill-disguised impatience. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice crackling over the line. "Lydia Prothero's confessed case closed. We've got her in custody, and the evidence is airtight." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Of course, Inspector, but I wonder about the Colonel's papers, those he feared were tampered with. Might they shed light on Mrs. Prothero's motives?" Slack grunted, promising to look into it, and Miss Marple hung up, satisfied that her nudge would prompt further inquiry. She knew Slack's thoroughness, when prodded, could uncover what her own gentle methods could not. Her next move was to visit Greystone Manor, under the guise of delivering a prayer book for the household's comfort in this trying time. She dressed with her usual carer soft blue dress, a shawl of fine wool, and a hat adorned with a single silk violet tand, packed her basket with the book and a small jar of her blackberry jam, a gesture to ease her entry. The manor's drive was quiet, the gravel damp from an overnight shower, and Jenny, the parlour-maid, answered the door with a weary smile. "Miss Marple, you're kind to come," she said, her eyes shadowed. "The place is like a ghost house now." Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy for the girl, and asked to see Major Henry, citing the prayer book's delivery. The Major received her in the drawing-room, a grand space with heavy drapes and a fire struggling against the morning chill. His face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot, his usual bluster replaced by a hollow defiance. "Miss Marple," he said, sinking into an armchair, "you've stirred a hornet's nest, haven't you? Lydia, my own wife. I never dreamed." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple, settling opposite, studied him closely. His shock seemed genuine, but she knew the heart could hide its secrets even from itself. "A dreadful shock," she said, her tone sympathetic, "but the truth has a way of healing in time. Did you suspect nothing, Major, of her distress?" Henry's jaw tightened. "She was quiet, always quiet. I thought it was her we never imagined she'd had." He shook his head, his hands clenching the chair's arms. Miss Marple probed. Gently, her questions cloaked in concern. "The Colonel's decision to favour Miss Vance must have strained you both," she said. "Did Lydia ever speak of it?" Henry's eyes narrowed, but he answered. "She hated it, said it was unfair, after all we'd done. But murder, I'd have stopped her if I'd known." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the tremor, wondering if it was grief or fear of exposure. She mentioned the missing papers, watching his reaction. "Mr. Pettigrew said the Colonel feared tampering," she said. "Did you notice anything amiss?" Henry's face darkened. "He was always fussing about those papers' letters accounts. Who knows? Said someone was after them, but he never named names." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple sensed evasion, a thread to pursue later. Leaving the Major, she sought out Mrs. Baines, whom Jenny said was in the kitchen. The housekeeper was scrubbing pots with fierce energy, her face drawn, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "Mrs. Baines," Miss Marple said, offering the jam, "I thought this might cheer the staff." The housekeeper took it with a curt nod, her hands still damp. Miss Marple lingered, mentioning Lydia's confession. "A tragic end," she said, "but I wonder about the arsenic, how it reached the study. Your pantry key, you said, was accessible." Mrs. Baines's lips thinned. "I told the police it was there for anyone, cook, Jenny, even the Major. I never thought," her voice faltered, and Miss Marple, her expression kind, patted her arm. "You couldn't know," she said, but her mind noted the housekeeper's defensiveness. a sign she feared blame for more than negligence. As she left Greystone, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Eleanor and Dr. Gale, whose roles, though cleared of murder, remained tangled in the case's aftermath. She stopped by the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was hosting Eleanor for the day, the girl still shaken by her ordeal. The vicarage parlour was warm, its fire crackling, and Eleanor, seated by the window, looked up with a fragile smile. "Miss Marple," she said, rising, "I can't thank you enough. You believed in me when no one else did." Miss Marple waved a hand, her eyes crinkling. "My dear, I only followed the truth. But tell me, how are you faring?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Better, now that it's over, but I feel betrayed. Lydia was kind to me, or so I thought." Dr. Gale arrived shortly after, his presence a steadying force for Eleanor. He shook Miss Marple's hand, his gratitude evident. "You've saved her," he said simply, his eyes warm. Miss Marple, settling with a cup of Mrs. Clement's tea, steered the conversation to the Colonel's papers, a lingering question. "Eleanor, did your uncle ever mention documents? He valued letters, perhaps, or accounts." Eleanor frowned, her brow creasing. "He was secretive about his desk," she said. "Once I saw him lock away a bundle of letters, but he wouldn't say what they were. He said they were private, not for me." Dr. Gale nodded. "He was odd about his study, kept it locked, even from me when I visited for his gout." The detail was small but significant, and Miss Marple filed it away, her mind turning to the study's contents. Had Lydia sought those papers, perhaps to destroy evidence of her own discontent, or to uncover something the Colonel held over her? She recalled a case from years past, where a locked diary had revealed a blackmail scheme. The killer's motive hidden in its pages. "Secrets," she murmured, sipping her tea, "are the roots of many crimes." She thanked Eleanor and Dr. Gale, promising to visit again, and left the vicarage. Her basket lighter, but her thoughts heavy with new possibilities. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit her fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed as a rhythmic counterpoint to her reflections. Lydia's confession had unveiled the truth of the murder, but the Colonel's papers remained a shadow, their contents a potential key to the why behind her act. Had they contained a threat of debt, a scandal that pushed Lydia to desperation? Or were they a red herring, a distraction from her simpler motive of envy? Miss Marple pictured the study, its locked desk, the decanter gleaming in the lamplight. The thumb mark, she was certain, had been Lydia's masterstroke, a cruel mimicry of Eleanor's touch. But the arsenic's path from pantry to glass required precision, a detail she had yet to fully trace. To clarify, she telephoned Mr. Pettigrew, the Colonel's solicitor, under the pretext of confirming a church donation in the Colonel's memory. Pettigrew, ever meticulous, mentioned the papers in passing. "Lucius was obsessive about his correspondence," he said. "He showed me a letter once, from a creditor pressing for payment Henry's debts, I believe. Said he'd keep it safe, in case he needed leverage." Miss Marple thanked him, her suspicion growing. A letter about Henry's debts could have alarmed Lydia, fearing ruin if the Colonel used it against them. Had she killed to silence that threat, or was her jealousy of Eleanor the sole spur? Her thoughts were interrupted by a visit from Griselda, Mrs. Clement's lively cousin, who arrived with a basket of pears and a fresh wave of gossip. "Miss Marple, the village is buzzing," she said, flopping into a chair. "They say Lydia planned it for months, even tested the arsenic on the rats first." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. did they, now, she said. Softly, Griselda nodded, oblivious to the significance. And Major Henry's been at the Red Lion, swearing he knew nothing, says Lydia, acted alone. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was elsewhere, passing this new rumour. Testing arsenic suggested premeditation, a detail Lydia's confession had omitted. Was it village exaggeration, or a clue to her methodical nature? To test this, Miss Marple visited the Red Lion that afternoon, under the guise of meeting Raymond. For tea, the pub was quieter now, its patrons subdued by the case's resolution. Major Henry was absent, but the barman, a talkative man named Gibbs, was happy to chat. "The Major's been in a state," he said, polishing a glass. "Says Lydia fooled him, but I reckon he knew more than he lets on always complaining. About the Colonel's money." Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland, but her thoughts quickened. Henry's ignorance was plausible, but his debts and temper made him a potential catalyst, even if not a conspirator. She thanked Gibbs, leaving a small tip, and returned home, her mind weaving this thread into the pattern as evening fell. Miss Marple prepared a simple supper mushroom soup and a slice of crusty bread, her thoughts circling the truth unveiled. Lydia's act was clear, driven by jealousy and fear of ruin. She had poisoned the Colonel, using Mrs. Baines's arsenic and Eleanor's glove to shift blame. Yet the papers nagged at her, their absence a gap in the narrative. She pictured Lydia in the study, her hands steady as she poured the poison, her heart cold with purpose. The thumb mark was her flourish, a cruel twist to ensure Eleanor's downfall. Miss Marple recalled a village murder from decades past, where a forged note had framed a rival. The killer's motive rooted in a hidden debt. The past, she murmured, echoes the present. The village clock chimed 9, its notes soft in the cool air. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to close her curtains, her gaze lingering on the darkened lane. Lydia's confession had unveiled the truth, but the Colonel's papers remained a shadow, their secrets perhaps lost with his death. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet tenacity, felt the case nearing its end, the mosaic almost complete. She would speak with Slack tomorrow, ensuring the study was searched, the papers found. For now, she lit her lamp, her heart light with the certainty that justice, though painful, had prevailed, one careful observation at a time. Chapter 10. The Village Restored. The 10th day since Colonel Lucius Prothero's poisoning dawned over St. Mary Mead with a serene brilliance, the autumn sun bathing the village in a warm, amber light that softened the edges of its ancient stone walls and thatched roofs. The tumult of Lydia Prothero's confession had settled like dust after a storm, leaving the community to grapple with a truth both shocking and sobering. The thumb mark, once a damning emblem of Eleanor Vance's guilt, was now revealed as Lydia's cruel deception, a ploy born of jealousy and desperation to secure her husband's inheritance. For Miss Jane Marple, clipping the last of her marigolds in her cottage garden, the case was nearly complete. Yet a few delicate threads concerning the Colonel's papers and the household's final reckoning required her gentle touch to weave into place. Today she would ensure the village was restored, its harmony rekindled through the quiet work of truth. Miss Marple's cottage, with its rose-patterned wallpaper and scent of beeswax, was a haven where her thoughts could unfold. With the clarity of her neatly tended flower bed, as she sipped her morning tea, her knitting idle on the side table, she reflected on the mosaic she had crafted, the thumb mark's calculated forgery, Major Henry's debt-fueled resentment, Mrs. Baines's unwitting provision of arsenic, Dr. Simon Gale's steadfast devotion, and Lydia's venomous envy, which had culminated in murder. Lydia's confession, elicited by Miss Marple's deftly set trap, had laid bare the crime, but questions lingered had the Colonel's papers held. A secret that pushed Lydia to act, and was Major Henry truly ignorant of his wife's scheme? Miss Marple recalled a case from her early years in a coastal town, where a family's reconciliation after a theft had hinged on uncovering a hidden letter, its contents the final key to peace. Resolution, she murmured, setting her cup down, requires every piece to fit. Her first task was to visit the vicarage, where Eleanor was staying, to offer support and glean any final insights into the Colonel's papers. Miss Marple, dressed with her customary Care's soft lavender dress, a shawl of fine merino wool, and a hat adorned with a single silk pansiand, packed her basket with a small pot of her honey, a gesture of goodwill. The village was stirring, its lanes alive with the clop of a horse-drawn cart and the chatter of children bound for school. At the post office, Mrs. Price leaned out, her voice low with awe. "Miss Marple, you've done it again." Lydia Prothero, of all peoplehood, have thought. Miss Marple smiled, her expression demure. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Mrs. Price," she said, and continued on, her mind already sifting the day's possibilities. The vicarage, with its ivy-clad walls and riotous garden, was a welcoming sight. Mrs. Clement greeted Miss Marple with a warm embrace, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, ushering her into the parlour, where a fire crackled against the morning chill. Eleanor was there, seated by a window with a book, her face less strained than before, though shadows lingered in her eyes. Dr. Simon Gale sat nearby, his presence a quiet anchor, his hand resting lightly on Eleanor's arm. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, rising, her voice soft but steady, "I owe you my life." Miss Marple waved a hand, her eyes crinkling. "My dear, I only followed where the facts led. But tell me, how are you now?" Eleanor's smile was fragile but genuine. "Relieved, but it's strange, knowing Lydia hated me so. I thought she was my friend." Dr. Gale's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes warm with concern. Miss Marple settled with a cup of tea, her basket at her feet, and steered the conversation to the Colonel's papers, a lingering enigma. "Eleanor," she said, "you mentioned your uncle locked away letters. Did you ever see them, or hear him speak of their importance?" Eleanor frowned, her brow creasing. "Only once," she said. "He was angry, said they were proof of treachery. His words. I thought he meant Major Henry, because of his debts, but he wouldn't say more." Dr. Gale nodded, adding, "Lucius was cagey about his desk. When I treated his gout, he'd watch me like a hawk if I neared it. I assumed it was old military secrets, but now," his voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Proof of treachery could mean many things: a financial betrayal, a personal slight, or something that threatened Lydia's precarious stability. She recalled a case from her youth, where a locked box of letters had revealed a blackmail plot, the killer's motive buried in their ink. "Letters," she murmured, "are often the heart of a secret." She thanked Eleanor and Dr. Gale, promising to send a recipe for her honey cake, and left the vicarage, her mind turning to Greystone Manor. Her next stop was the manor itself, where she hoped to speak with Major Henry and, if possible, examine the study. She arrived under the pretext of delivering a church pamphlet on grief, her basket now lighter but her purpose firm. The manor's drive was silent, its windows staring blankly, and Jenny, answering the door, looked worn but relieved. "Major Henry's in the library," she said, "but Mrs. Baines left yesterday's, said she couldn't stay after all that's happened." Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy for the housekeeper, whose role, though peripheral, had cost her peace. She followed Jenny to the library, a dim room lined with leather-bound volumes, where Major Henry sat slumped in a chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice rough, "come to gloat, have you?" His attempt at bravado was hollow, and Miss Marple, settling opposite, offered the pamphlet with a gentle smile. "Only to offer comfort, Major," she said. "This has been a trial for you all." Henry's eyes, red-rimmed, met hers, and for a moment his guard dropped. "Lydia, I never saw it coming," he said, his voice low. "I knew she was upset about the will, but murder? I'd have stopped her if I'd known." Miss Marple studied him, noting the slump of his shoulders, the tremor in his hand. His ignorance seemed plausible, but she probed gently, her tone one of quiet inquiry. "The Colonel's papers," she said. "He feared they were tampered with. Did you ever see them, or know what troubled him?" Henry's face clouded. "He was always muttering about those blasted papers letters. He said that could ruin someone. I thought he was paranoid, but now, maybe Lydia was afraid of them." His words were vague, but Miss Marple sensed a truth buried in his reluctance. She pressed further, mentioning the creditor's letter Mr. Pettigrew had described. "Could it have concerned your debts?" she asked. Henry flinched, his glass clinking against the table. "Possibly," he admitted. "Lucius loaned me money once, but he held it over me, threatened to call it in. If Lydia knew," his voice broke, and Miss Marple, her heart softening, saw a man grappling with his own failures. Leaving the Major, she asked Jenny to show her the study, claiming a need to retrieve a dropped handkerchief from a prior visit. The study was as she remembered: heavy desk, leather chair, decanter now removed by the police, but the air felt lighter, as if the truth had lifted a curse. Miss Marple approached the desk, its drawers still locked, and noted a faint scratch near the keyhole, a sign of forced entry. "Curious," she murmured, her fingers brushing the wood. Jenny, hovering nervously, said, "The police looked there, miss, but found nothing, said the papers were gone." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion growing. Lydia, she realized, might have destroyed the papers to hide her motive, or they held no significance at all, a distraction from her simpler envy. Her final task was to meet Inspector Slack, whom she found at the village hall, reviewing statements with his usual impatience. She approached under the guise of returning a borrowed umbrella, her basket now empty but her purpose undimmed. "Inspector," she said, her tone mild, "I trust Mrs. Prothero's confession has clarified matters." Slack grunted, his pencil tapping his notebook. "Clear as day, Miss Marple. She poisoned the Colonel, used the girl's glove for the thumb mark, and tried to pin the arsenic on Baines. We're searching for those papers, but they're likely ashes by now." Miss Marple nodded, suggesting a check of the study's fireplace for traces of burned documents. "A small thing," she said, "but it might confirm her intent." Slack, though skeptical, agreed, and Miss Marple left, satisfied that her nudge would tie the final knot back at her cottage. Miss Marple lit her fire and settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as a soothing rhythm to her thoughts. The village was restoring itself, its equilibrium returning with the truth's unveiling. Eleanor, cleared of suspicion, was planning to sell Greystone and marry Dr. Gale, their future a bright thread in the village's tapestry. Mrs. Baines, chastened by her unwitting role, had retreated to her cousin's home, her pride bruised but her conscience clear. Major Henry, humbled by his wife's crime and his own failures, had withdrawn from the Red Lion spotlight, his bluster silenced by shame. And Lydia, now in custody, faced justice, her jealous heart the architect of her downfall. Miss Marple mind turned to the papers, their absence a minor discord in the case's resolution. She pictured Lydia in the study, her hands steady as she poured the poison, her heart cold with purpose. The papers, if they existed, might have detailed Henry's debts or a slight that fueled her envy. But their loss was not critical. Thumb mark and arsenic told the story clearly. She recalled a village scandal from decades past, where a burned will had obscured a motive. Yet the killer's confession had sufficed for justice. The heart, she murmured, reveals what papers cannot. Her thoughts were interrupted by a visit from Mrs. Clement, who arrived with a basket of apples and a warm smile. "Jane, you've worked miracles," she said, settling by the fire. "The village is talking of nothing but your cleverness." Miss Marple waved a hand, her eyes twinkling. "I only listened, my dear, and watched. People are their own best witnesses." Mrs. Clement laughed, then grew serious. "Eleanor's planning a quiet wedding," she said. "She and Dr. Gale want to start fresh, away from Greystone's ghosts." Miss Marple nodded, her heart lightened by the news. The village, she knew, would heal, its rhythm restored by time and truth. As evening fell, Miss Marple prepared a simple supper, leek soup and a slice of soda bread, her thoughts circling the case's conclusion. The thumb mark had been Lydia's cruelest act, a betrayal of Eleanor's trust, but its exposure had freed the girl and revealed the killer. She pictured the study, its desk now silent, its secrets either burned or irrelevant. The village clock chimed 8, its notes soft in the cool air. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to close her curtains, her gaze lingering on the darkened lane. The village was restored, its harmony fragile but enduring, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, felt the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, one careful observation at a time, to ensure no stone was left unturned. She resolved to write to Inspector Slack the next day, suggesting a final check of Greystone's attics for any overlooked papers, though she doubted they held more than the confession had revealed. For now, she lit her lamp, her heart at peace. St. Mary Mead, with its secrets and its strength, would carry on, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, would be there, her needles clicking softly, ready for the next mystery to unfold.